Hashem. Today's Daf Yomi is Nazir Yud Gimel. We're going to start on the bottom of Yud Beis and Beis 12b at the bottom. At the Mishnah, person says on the bottom of 12b. Person says the following. The person says, "Hareini Nazir Sheyeli Ben." A person says, "I will be a Nazirite when I have a son." Vin Noad Lo Ben, and then actually he has a son. Harei Nazir. Under those circumstances, he's a Nazirite. Noad Lo Bas Tumtum Androgynous. Let's say he doesn't have a son, but he has a daughter, or he has a tumtum. Tumtum is somebody whose genitalia is covered up, so we don't know what exactly the gender is. Androgynous, somebody who has male and female characteristics. And under those circumstances, he's not a Nazir, ain't no Nazir. Im Amar, if he said, Kishieli Vlad, if he says, I am a Nazirite if I have an offspring, Afilu Noad Lo Bas Tumtum Androgynous, then even if he has an offspring who is a tumtum and an androgynous, Harei Zen Nazir. We're saying he is a Nazirite. All that is straightforward, but now we go to the top of 13a. The top of 13a says, by the way, let me just pause for a second. Why is he even speaking like this? We're just talking about, we don't usually ask this question in the Gemara, but we're going to ask it now. Why is he even speaking like this? Why is he saying, I'm a Nazirite when I'll have a child, when I'll have a son? I'm a Nazirite when I'll have a child. Why is he talking like this? So we learn from here, the commentaries explain, and I'll even look to see if there is something in the Masifta footnotes. I don't know if there is, but the basic, there it is right here. The Masifta quotes Tosos on this, meaning to say, the Tosos writes, Pirush, Hodav Shevacha Kodesh Baruch Hu Shechinani Bezikani V'Noad Libein. He's saying, I want to give thanks and praise to God who blessed me to have a child. Meaning to say, a person should try to connect different milestones in their life with service to Hashem. The person says, if God is going to bless me, I am going to feel so indebted with such gratitude to God that I am going to try to take upon myself this enormous spiritual responsibility of becoming a Nazir. So that's what he says. So that's just a background. Why is a person speaking like this? And then, of course, as so often happens, you're very enthusiastic in the moment, and then a little bit later, you try to think, do I really need to do it? So that's the question. You say Nazir is pretty hard. No funerals, no wine. I can't I can't have l'chaim at the bris. So, okay. Now we're continuing with the Gemara in 13a. He pila ishto, eino Nazir. Let's say his wife has a child, and he pila normally means miscarried, but here means we're not sure if the child is viable. Then the Tanakama of our Mishnah says the offspring is not a Nazir. Then he's not a Nazir. Why? Because the Tanakama, as the Gemara is going to explain, follows the position of Rabbi Yehuda that Safek Nazir Slahakel, that we're going to be lenient in the case of an ambiguous situation with respect to a Nazirite. So in this case, we're talking about a child who was born, then the child died from an accident, God forbid, Rahman al-Islam, and so then we don't know if the child was viable. So therefore, for this reason, we say he's not a Nazir, because it follows the position of Rabbi Yehuda who says Safek Nazir Slahakel, whereas Rabbi Shimon says that we're strict. Rabbi Shimon follows the position of Safek Nazir Slahachmir. So Rabbi Shimon says in Haya Ben Kayama, so we don't know what to do over here. Then if we think that but you can't just be strict and bring the sacrifice in the temple because there's a problem. Because since you also have to bring a sin offering, you can't bring a voluntary sin offering. So Shimon says you have to say a conditional clause. Say if this child would have been viable, Harei ani Nazir, then I'm a Nazirite right now. Obligatory Nazirite to fulfill my vow, Nazir Chova. But if the child would not have been viable, Harei ani Nazir Nedava, then I'll be a voluntary Nazirite right now. And then Chazra v'Yoda, then the woman comes back and gives birth to a viable child, Nazir. Then, according to the first approach, okay, now he's a Nazirite. But according to the second approach, Rabbi Shimon says, Yomar Ima Rishon ben Kayama Arishon Chova V'Zunadavi. You have to do again another conditional clause. You say if the first one was binding, then was viable, then I was already an obligatory Nazir. So now Zunadavi. This is a voluntary. Otherwise, you say Arishon Nadava. The first one was voluntary, V'Zu Chova, and this one is obligatory. So the Gemara asks the question, Hi Maila Meimer, why do we need all this? Why do we need this case that if you say, if I give birth to a son, I'm a Nazirite? The Gemara explains, Mishum Seifa. Now, you all need it only because of the second clause. You don't need the first clause, but you need for the second clause where he says, Bas Tumtum Vandrogonus in a Nazir. That he says if he gives birth to a daughter or a Tumtum or androgynous, and he had made the conditional clause on the condition he gives birth to a son, then if he gives birth to a daughter, he's not binding, so he's not a Nazirite. So the Gemara says, Pshita, that's obvious. He said, if I give birth to a son, I'm a Nazirite. And I didn't give birth to the son, so of course I'm not a Nazirite. No, he didn't actually say if I give birth to a son. He said the words, if I'll give birth to a ben. And Ma'utim, he might have thought, like Kashavnahu the Kamer. He's saying that the word ben in Hebrew can also mean a son, or it can mean a family. And so therefore, Kamash Mandalo, we don't say that it could mean a family. It means he was referring to his son. Because by vows, we follow the way people have in mind what we think when they speak. Not what it says in the Webster's dictionary. We follow in mind what the implication of what people were saying, not what the technical term is. So that's the point. If he says when he has a child, then he'll be a Nazirite. Then even if he has a daughter or a tumtum or androgynous, he's a Nazirite. Gemara says, Pshita, well, that's obvious. What does it need to tell us that? That's exactly what he said. You might have thought, no, you might have thought when it says if he has a child, it means, we all know he was saying if he has a son. That's what he had in mind. So we say, Kamashon, we don't say that. Okay. Says the Talmud, that if the wife has a child and the child doesn't, it dies before we can determine if the child was viable, he's not a Nazirite. So whose position is that? That if the child dies before we determine if the child was viable, then he's not a Nazirite. Ban Katanila, who's the one who says that? Rabbi Yehuda, this is the position of Rabbi Yehuda decree. This is the position we had earlier in our Gemara on 8a, where Rabbi Yehuda says if a person makes a vow that if this pile of grain has a certain number of pounds in it, I'll be a Nazirite, and then the grain is stolen, Rabbi Yehuda says, well, there we'd say suffering Nazir Salakil. If it's an ambiguous case, we're going to be lenient. Rabbi Yehuda says you're not a Nazirite under those circumstances. So that's the position here, suffering Nazir Salakil. Whereas Rabbi Shimon says, Maya ben Kayama already Nazir. Rabbi Shimon says if it was a viable Nazir, if it was a viable, you say if the person would say under these circumstances, if it was a viable Nazirite, then I'm an obligatory Nazir. Otherwise, I voluntarily accept myself the vow of Naziris. So the Gemara says, so Rabbi Abba asked the question from Rabbi Funa. Let's say the person says, Areini Nazir l'kashayeli ben. Let's say a person says, I'll be a Nazirite when I have a son. V'pila ishto, and then his wife had a child, and we're not sure if this child is viable. V'hifrish karban, and with his wife had a child, and the child died, but we weren't sure if the child was viable, and he separated sacrifices for it. V'chazra v'yalda, and then she goes and gives birth to a twin that same day, and we're going to say. So the Gemara is going to say, what's the question? And the Gemara is going to conclude. You'll see where the Gemara ends up, and then I'll read the Rosh here. So the Pilish of Ifrish Karban Mechazav Yodamahu. We say Aliba Deman. Who is this question that we're asking? That we now have a question where she had a child. The first child died, and now she has a second child that same day, which is viable. So, and he separated the sacrifices before the second child was born. So the Gemara says, according to whom is it a question? Yeah, we have the Rabbi Shimon Ma'ati Bale. It's not even a question according to Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon suffering Nazir Salachmi. Rabbi Shimon said that we always have to be strict in a case of a doubt ambiguous Nazir. It's only a question according to Rabbi Yehuda who says something Nazir Slahaka. It says that in the case of an ambiguous Nazir, we're lenient. In this case, do we say from the fact that the second one was viable, it therefore gives us an indication that the first one is also viable? My kadosh alo kadosh. Do we say that this animal? So he had separated the animals when he thought that the offspring was viable. But now do we say that the offspring, we're not sure if it was viable or not? So do we say it was kadosh or not kadosh? So, and why is it an afkamina? What are we going to do with these animals? We're not going to bring them, the Talmud assumes. So it's legis also avabo. Can we work the animals or can we shear it? So I'll read the Rashi here. Masik to me, it's the question according to Rabbi Yehuda, who says that if it was a non-viable child, if the child died and we're not sure if it was viable, it's not a Nazirite. And so obviously, if you had separate these animals according to Rabbi Yehuda and the child died, then the animals are not sacred. But now that she gave birth that same day, this is a proof that maybe the first children were viable, because a woman is not going to give birth and then come back and give birth again and assume that one would be viable and not the other one. Or maybe we say, no, that it would be. So that's the question. Gemara leaves this question unresolved. Teiku. So now we have another question. Bai mine ben rechume ne abaye. So this is ben rechume. This is what we call, I don't know, the word for something that appears only once in the Bible it's called in Latin is a hapax legomenon. So this person, this is a person who only appears once in the entire Bible and in the entire Talmud. This is the only time he appears. This guy hit the lottery. He showed up to the Talmud discussion. He showed up to the Daf Yomi Shir that day, and he asked something, and he got in. Ben Rechume got into the Talmud forever. He was Kona Olam Haba. He acquired the world to come. And this is what he says. He says, so Ben Rechume asked the question from Abaye. What if you ask the following case? Areni Nazir Ben. He says, I'll be a Nazirite when I have a son. Okay, fine. We already know that you're a Nazirite, but his friend is passing by. Vishama Chavero Va'amar, and his friend was passing by. He says, Va'alai, and upon me. So, meaning to say, I also am taking this vow. So Reuven says, I'm going to be a Nazirite when I have a son. Shimon's walking by, hears this, and he says, and upon me. Mahu, what's he saying? Is he saying, Adibure Mashma? Is he saying, I'm becoming it, meaning to say, exactly like the first person said, that if I have a son, I'll be a Nazirite? Is that what he's saying? Or is he saying, Agufe Mashma? Or if he's saying, excuse me, just the opposite. Is he saying, if you become a Nazirite, one second, according to the first approach, he's saying, if you become a Nazirite, I'm a Nazirite. Or according to the second approach, he's saying, if I have a son, then I'll have a Nazirite. So what's he saying? Which one is he saying? Is he saying, the first guy walks by and says, if I have a son, I'll be a Nazirite. Shimon hears him and he says, upon me. So what's he asking? Is he saying, if you become a Nazirite in the end, I'm also a Nazirite? Or is he saying, if I have a son, I'm also a Nazirite? So that's what he's asking. And it has nothing to do with whether or not the first guy has a son. So that's the question. Now, imtim salom maragufe mashma, if you want to say, all he's saying is, if I have a son, I'm also a Nazirite. But let's say he says, then let's say he formulates it differently. Let's say he says, Amar Hareini Nazuk Shel Misham Chavero Amar Va'ani. He doesn't say alai and upon me, which maybe more is upon me having a son, but it's I also, or me too. What's the law there? Anav Sheikha Amar. There is he saying Va'ani, meaning to say that. Is it just like, in that case, is he saying that like his friend, if he says, is he saying basically, if I have a son, I'm a Nazirite? Or maybe he's saying, I love you so much. And so just like you're a Nazirite if you'll have a son, also, if you have a son, I'm also a Nazirite. So we don't know what he's saying. And then the third possibility that this beautiful man, Ben Ruchume, by the way, there are several cases in the Shas where there's a person who only appears one time, and this one name is connected to the sugya itself. So maybe they gave him that name. So here, since it uses the word rachamim, mercy, in the discussion, maybe that's where he got his name from. It's not his real given name at birth. The third case is im timtzi omar kol ba'ampei. Anytime he says the word I, kisifale milsa, he's basically going to be like, he's embarrassed if he won't join with him, and he's accepting upon himself Nazirus to show that he wants to be part of him. Let's say he says Amar Areni Nazir Shiela Ploni Ben. So now we have a little bit different. Let's say the first guy says, I'll be a Nazirite. Reuven says, I'll be a Nazirite when Shimon has a son. Now Levi's walking by, and he says, I also, me too. What's the law? Mi amrinan shelo befanav anav shekamer. Well, since Shimon is not there at all, Reuven's just making the vow about Shimon. So obviously, Levi's just talking about himself, and he's saying, I'll also be a Nazirite when I have a son. Or maybe what he's saying is, I love Shimon just like you. And just like you're saying you'll be a Nazirite when Shimon has a son, I'll also be a Nazirite when Shimon has a son. So that's a third possibility. And the Gemara says in all these cases, Tibaye. Tibaye is the way, Mesechas Nazir, they often say the word teku. We throw up our hands. We don't know how to resolve this question. So we basically leave that question unresolved. Whether if a person says me too, he's saying I'm going to be a Nazirite when you have a son, or I'm saying when I have a son, I have a Nazirite. His language is not precise, and all the different possibilities there, we leave that question unresolved. Okay. Next case. Okay, so in the previous Mishnah, we learned the law of somebody who accepts the Nazirus upon himself when he has a son. So now we have the case of somebody who accepts upon himself an additional Nazirus aside from the one that will fall upon him when he has a son. So now it gets to get a little bit tricky this week. Areni Nazir, let's say a person says, I'll be a Nazir. Meaning to say, if a person says Areni Nazir, he's immediately a Nazir. 113b, the Mishnah. And then he says, Vin Nazir Kishieli Ben. And then he says, and also when I have a son, I'll be a Nazirite. So he's accepted two things. First, he says, I'm a Nazirite right away. And then he says, and when I have a son, I'll also be a Nazirite. Okay. Before he gives, so there in this case, he accepted his Nazirus immediately. So Hitzchil Mona Es Shelo. He starts to count his first Nazirus immediately. And then afterwards, before he completes his Nazirus, Noad Lo Ben. And then let's say before he completes his Nazirus, so let's say day 20 of his first count, it's a 30-day Nazirus, he gives birth to a son. No problem there. You complete the first 30 days. And then you complete the Nazirus of his son. Okay, that's a straightforward case. Everybody with me? No problems. Next case, a little tricky, because you reversed it. In the next case, he says, Hareini Nazir Kishieli Ben. He puts the conditional clause first. He says, I will be a Nazir when I have a son. And then he says, Vin Nazir, and I'm a Nazir right now, without any condition. So therefore, the first thing he accepted upon himself was, I'll be a Nazirite when I have a son. And then he says, and I'm a Nazir right now. So he's still Monesh Shalom. So he starts to count his Nazirus there. But the first thing was, he says, the conditional clause. But let's say, so he starts to count his Nazirus. Let's say he gets to day 20. And then his wife gives birth to his son. Then he gives birth to his son. That Nazir is supposed to come first. So now what does he do? He interrupts his Nazirus, because that was the second Nazirus that he had accepted upon himself. Meiniach es shelo. He interrupts his Nazirus. Umona es shalbeno. Counts the 30 days of Nazir period for his son. And when he concludes the Nazirus for his son, Mashlim es shalo. He completes his own Nazirus that he accepted upon himself, which he had started, but it was a second acceptance of Nazirus. And then he brings, and there's a lot of, they don't really define it here. There's a lot of discussion about this amongst the Rishonim, exactly how he brings the sacrifices, but then he takes the concluding haircut. And then there's another problem, by the way, with Nazirus. You can't just say, okay, just be Nazirus when you're not supposed to. No, there's another problem. In addition to the sacrifices, a Nazir has to shave off all the hair from his head, including the parts of their hair that you're typically speaking prohibited to shave, like the payos. So he cuts off the corner of his head. That is a mitzvah to do if you're a Nazir, but it's prohibited to do if you're not a Nazir. So you have to be certain. So here he brings his sacrifice, he shaves off the hair, and he brings two sets of sacrifices at the conclusion of Nazirus. One for the second Nazirus, and one second, let me just finish this, and then I'll come back to take questions. One for his second set of Nazirus, and one for the Nazirus for his son. And the reason is he needs to complete the Nazirus for his son before the second Nazirus, which he had accepted upon himself. So Rava asked the question. Now, as I start to get a little tricky, Rava asked the question. Rava says, let's say a person says, Amar Areini Nazir Achar Esrim Yom. A person says, I'll be a Nazirite in 20 days from now. And then after 20 days, I'll be a Nazirite for 30 days. So his Nazirus is supposed to end after 50 days, right? But then he also says, then the guy's on a roll that day. He says, right now I'm a Nazirite for 100 days. So first he says, I'm a Nazirite in 20 days. And then I'll be a Nazirite for 30 more days. And then he says, I'm a Nazirite right now for 100 days. Now you're saying, why would anybody say something like this? Two reasons. One, the rabbis need to deal with every topic, every possible outcome. And two, ask Steve if his clients ever say dumb things. People do that all the time. Like, if I would have just kept my big mouth shut, I wouldn't be here in the first place. The guy's speaking like an idiot. So what? Good for business. So now, what's the law? What's the law? Does the second Nazirus, because he says the first one, he says, I'm going to be Nazirite 20 days from now for 30 days. And the second one, he says, I'm going to be Nazirite right now for 100 days. Does the second Nazirus take place immediately or only after he's upheld the first one? That's so on one hand, we say, given the Halan Meya Be'esrin Lo Shlomen. Do we say that since these 100 days will not be finished before we get to the 20 days, therefore, and so therefore he's going to need to stop his Nazirus after 20 days in order to complete the 30 days of Nazirus that he accepted upon himself first. And since he doesn't want to stop his Nazirus in the middle, Lo Chayolin, he's not allowed to interrupt it. Or do we say, "Oh, Delma Kivan Islay Gidol Seir Levasof"? Or do we say, since he's going to have at the end of the 100 days, he's going to have what's called Gidol Seir Chayo, and therefore the Nazirus of the 100 days will apply, and from them within them he can really maintain two consecutive. Concurrent vows of Nazirus. What is Gidol Seir? At the conclusion of his Nazirus, it's a fundamental idea. At the conclusion of his Nazirus, he is going to have a mitzvah to cut off all his hair. And as a condition of this mitzvah, it has to be a 30-day growth, meaning to say that he has to cut it, that if, for example, let's say a robber, they cut off his hair in the middle, or bandits, they cut off in the middle, even though he did nothing wrong, he can't cut off his hair until it grows 30 days. So in this case, even if they'll start his Nazirus now, and it'll include within the middle of it the 30 days Nazirus of the second, of the one he had accepted first, he's still going to have the growth. And so therefore, he could do the 30 days, cut the hair, and then continue on, and they'll still have the conclusion. So the Gemara says, okay, we're going to have to get into this question later on, but I just want to say one thing. This week's staff is going to deal with one of my favorite sugyas in the Shas this week, which is a person who accepts upon himself a vow of Nazirus while he's sitting in a cemetery. We're going to be coming to that. You say, I want to be a Nazir while you're in a cemetery, which obviously a Nazir can't come in contact with a dead body. So he asked the question, why would somebody ever do such a thing? And my answer to that is, we see people do this all the time. The person sitting in there and davening on Yom Kippur while they're thinking about how they're going to say Lashon Hara about their friend. We have these contradictions at the same time. Anyway, George has a question. Let's hear your question, George.